The unyielding power of weather in military history. The mightiest armies in history weren't defeated by superior tactics, stronger weapons, or better trained soldiers. They were crushed by rain, snow, wind, and mud. From Kublai Khan's invincible armada splintering under typhoon winds to Napoleon's Grande Armée freezing in the Russian winter, weather has toppled empires, reversed conquests, and rewritten the fate of nations. These aren't just tales of bad luck or poor timing. They're testament to humanity's eternal struggle to master the uncontrollable forces that govern our world. In the end, every general learns the same humbling lesson. Mother Nature remains the ultimate commander-in-chief. What follows are the 5 most dramatic weather events that changed the course of military history. Stories of hubris and heroism, of catastrophic miscalculations and brilliant adaptations, of armies that marched forth as conquerors only to be undone by the awesome power of Earth's atmosphere. These are more than just military disasters. They're the moments that forced humanity to revolutionize how we predict, prepare for, and deal with the greatest force multiplier in the art of war, the weather itself. The divine wind, nature's fury against the Mongol fleet. The waves started small. On the morning of August 15th, 1281, Kublai Khan's commanders noticed an unusual chop in the waters off Japan's western coast. The massive invasion fleet, over 4,400 ships carrying 140,000 men, barely registered the change. Their victory seemed as inevitable as the rising sun. After all, they commanded the largest naval invasion force the world would see until D-Day, nearly 7 centuries later. By noon, the sky had turned an ominous green. The Mongol warriors, masters of the Asian steppes but novices at sea, felt their ships begin to pitch and roll. The Japanese defenders, watching from the stone walls of Hakata Bay, dropped to their knees in prayer. Their emperor had spent months beseeching the gods at the sacred shrine of ice, begging for divine intervention. Now, as the typhoon's full fury unleashed itself upon the invasion fleet, it seemed their prayers had been answered. The destruction defied comprehension. Mongol ships, built in the Chinese style with high sides and flat bottoms, proved catastrophically unsuited for the storm. Massive waves crashed over their gunwales, while the wind, howling at over 100 knots, threw vessels against each other like toys. Sailors who had never learned to swim thrashed helplessly in the churning waters. The few ships that tried to escape to open sea were driven onto jagged rocks or capsized by the tremendous swells. When dawn broke the next day, the survivors faced a scene of apocalyptic devastation. Nearly 3/4 of the fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. The beaches were littered with splintered timbers, broken weapons, and bodies. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed poised to engulf Japan in its ever-expanding territory, had been shattered by what the Japanese would call kamikaze, the divine wind. This wasn't the first time nature had saved Japan from invasion. 7 years earlier, in 1274, another typhoon had destroyed a smaller Mongol fleet. But the 1281 storm proved decisive. Kublai Khan, who had never lost a major campaign in his life, was forced to abandon his dreams of Japanese conquest. The cost of the disaster nearly bankrupted his Yuan dynasty, marking the beginning of the end for Mongol expansion. The kamikaze typhoons transcended mere military history. They became central to Japan's national identity. For centuries, Japanese leaders would point to these storms as proof of their island's divine protection. In World War II, the term would be tragically co-opted for the suicide pilots who flew their planes into American ships, hoping to replicate nature's ancient defense of their homeland. But perhaps the most profound legacy was one of hubris and humility. The Mongols, who had conquered most of the known world through superior military might, discovered that nature recognized no empire. Their disaster would become the first of many pivotal moments in military history where weather proved to be the ultimate arbiter of human ambition. Napoleon's frozen defeat, the Russian campaign of 1812. Napoleon Bonaparte stared at the thermometer outside his command post in Smolensk. November 14, 1812, minus 21 degrees Celsius. His breath crystallized in the air as he cursed the dropping mercury. The Emperor of France, master of Europe, had finally met his match, not in the Russian army, but in the merciless Russian winter. The Grande Armée that had marched into Russia in June was the most magnificent fighting force Europe had ever seen. 680,000 men, 146,000 horses, state-of-the-art artillery, and enough supplies to feed a small nation. By November, it had been reduced to a stumbling column of frozen shadows. The horses, crucial for cavalry, transport, and food, died by the thousands, their iron-studded hooves unable to find purchase on the ice. Veterans who had conquered Egypt's deserts now succumbed to frostbite in their sleep, never waking from their frozen bivouacs. The temperatures that winter plunged to levels that hadn't been seen in a century. Field Marshal Mikhail Kutuzov, commanding the Russian forces, had expected the usual winter advantages, but even he was stunned by nature's savage assault on the French. His scouts reported surreal scenes. French soldiers burning their own wagons for warmth, eating their horses raw, abandoning priceless artillery pieces in snowdrifts. The once proud army's retreat had become a desperate race against the thermometer. Napoleon's military genius proved useless against the cold. His soldiers' muskets shattered like glass in the frost. The cannonballs bounced harmlessly off frozen ground. Even the army's medical supplies froze solid, leaving nothing to treat the thousands suffering from hypothermia and frostbite. The emperor had planned for every military contingency except one: what to do when the very air became a weapon. In Moscow, watching his capital burn, Tsar Alexander I had made a fateful decision. Rather than commit to a decisive battle, he would let General Winter do the fighting. The Russians traded space for time, retreating deeper into their vast territory, leaving scorched earth behind. They knew what Napoleon refused to accept, that the cold would accomplish what armies could not. The final toll defied belief. Of the 680,000 men who had marched into Russia, fewer than 27,000 stumbled out. The Grande Armée's destruction marked the beginning of the end for the French Empire. Napoleon, who had rewritten the rules of warfare, discovered that nature's laws were immutable. His disaster established a brutal truth that would haunt military planners for generations. No army, no matter how powerful, could triumph without Winter's permission. In the wars that followed, armies would develop cold weather gear, build weatherproof supply lines, and train for winter warfare. But the lesson of 1812 remained. When military ambition collides with meteorological reality, nature always wins. D-Day's critical weather decision. Operation Overlord's meteorological gamble. Group Captain James Stagg hadn't slept in 48 hours. In a cramped meteorological office in southern England, he studied the latest weather charts with bloodshot eyes. It was June 4th, 1944, and the fate of Europe rested on his forecast. In 5 hours, he would have to tell General Eisenhower whether to launch the largest amphibious invasion in history, or postpone it until the next viable moon and tide cycle, weeks away. The pressure was suffocating. Every Allied weatherman knew about the World War I disaster at Gallipoli, where bad weather had doomed an amphibious assault and cost thousands of lives. But D-Day was infinitely more complex. 156,000 troops, 11,590 aircraft, and 6,939 vessels all had to arrive precisely coordinated. They needed waves under 3 feet, light winds, minimal cloud cover for bombers, and a full moon for paratroopers. In early June on the English Channel, finding such conditions was like threading a meteorological needle. German meteorologists, working with far less data, had concluded that no invasion was possible. Their weather stations in the Atlantic had been systematically destroyed by Allied forces, leaving them partially blind. They couldn't see the peculiar break in the weather that Stagg had spotted, a narrow 36-hour window between 2 massive storm systems. But even Stagg's colleagues disagreed about this window. American forecasters predicted clear skies. The British expected storms. As senior meteorologist, Stagg would have to choose between them. At midnight, in a schoolhouse converted to Supreme Allied headquarters, Stagg delivered his verdict to Eisenhower. The original June 5th date was impossible. The Channel would be a maelstrom. But June 6th, despite marginal conditions, offered a chance. In that moment, Stagg's forecast became the most consequential weather prediction ever made. Eisenhower, after a long silence, simply said, "Okay, let's go." The audacity of launching on June 6th caught the Germans completely off guard. Field Marshal Rommel, convinced the weather made invasion impossible, had returned to Germany for his wife's birthday. Many senior officers were away at a War Games conference. German coastal units, battling the same wind and waves that challenged the Allies, had relaxed their vigilance. When the sun rose on June 6th, the Allied Armada faced exactly the conditions Stagg had predicted: broken clouds at bombardment height, acceptable visibility for aircraft, and wind and waves just barely within operational limits. The invasion succeeded, but barely. 24 hours later, the Channel was engulfed in one of the worst storms in decades. Had Eisenhower followed his original plan for June 5th, D-Day would have ended in catastrophe. Had he waited for the next window in mid-June, he would have faced something even worse: the worst Channel storm in 40 years. Stagg's forecast revolutionized military planning. Weather prediction, once an afterthought, became a central pillar of military science. The invasion proved that mastering meteorology could provide an edge as decisive as any weapon. Modern militaries would soon establish their own weather services, launch weather satellites, and develop sophisticated modeling systems, all because one sleepless meteorologist in England found a 36-hour window to change history: Operation Barbarossa and the defeat by Rasputitsa. The German tank commander stared in disbelief at his stuck Panzer IV. The fearsome machine, capable of crushing armies and smashing through fortified positions, had been defeated by mud. Not just any mud, but Rasputitsa, the twice-yearly Russian mud season that turned the countryside into a bottomless morass. By October 1941, this mud had accomplished what the Red Army couldn't. It had stopped the Wehrmacht cold. Hitler's invasion of Russia, Operation Barbarossa, had begun as a masterpiece of mechanized warfare. The Wehrmacht's initial advance averaged an astounding 40 miles per day. But as autumn rain saturated the Russian soil, the advance slowed to a crawl. Roads dissolved into ribbons of slime. Fields became swamps. The same tanks that had conquered France in weeks now sat immobilized, their engines screaming helplessly as they sank deeper into the mire. The Rasputitsa transformed the battlefield into a medieval nightmare. German supply trucks, carrying vital fuel and ammunition, couldn't reach the front lines. Horses, which still provided 80% of the Wehrmacht's transportation, died by the thousands trying to pull equipment through the mud. The mighty German war machine, built for lightning warfare, found itself moving at the speed of squelching boots. Soviet defenders had a secret weapon against the mud: the T-34 tank. Its wide tracks distributed weight better than German tanks, allowing it to navigate terrain that bogged down its enemies. The Russians also knew the few roads that remained passable, ancient paths built on log corduroy foundations that had supported commerce through mud seasons for centuries. This local knowledge proved as valuable as any military intelligence. By the time the autumn mud hardened into winter ice, the Germans had lost their chance to capture Moscow. The Rasputitsa had bought the Soviets precious weeks to reinforce their capital. When the Wehrmacht finally resumed its advance in late November, it was too late. The Russian winter had arrived. Hitler's forces, exhausted by their battle with the mud, were in no condition to face general winter. The mud season's impact went far beyond Operation Barbarossa. Military engineers studied the Rasputitsa's effects to develop new vehicle designs. The US Army's famous Jeep, the British Universal Carrier, and a generation of Cold War military vehicles all reflected lessons learned from the Russian mud. Modern military tires, tracks, and ground pressure calculations can trace their evolution to the Wehrmacht's muddy catastrophe. Geography professors had warned about the Rasputitsa. Russian historians had written about it. Napoleon's army had suffered through it. But Hitler, like so many commanders before him, had dismissed weather as a mere inconvenience. He discovered, at the cost of an empire, that nature's simplest weapons are often its most effective. Desert Storm's invisible enemy, the challenge of nature in modern warfare. The F-117 stealth fighter pilot checked his multi-million-dollar targeting system, then checked it again. Somewhere below, through the howling sandstorm, lay his target in Baghdad. But the sophisticated sensors, designed to penetrate darkness and defeat enemy defenses, were being blinded by billions of microscopic sand particles. Operation Desert Storm was discovering that even the most advanced military in history couldn't escape nature's fury. The Shamal winds that swept across the battlefield in 1991 were the same ones that had tormented armies since ancient Mesopotamia. These sandstorms could arrive with shocking suddenness, reducing visibility to mere feet and turning day into an eerie orange twilight. But modern warfare added new vulnerabilities. Laser-guided bombs went blind, infrared sensors failed, helicopter rotors were sandblasted into uselessness, and jet engines choked on the fine dust. Coalition forces found their high-tech advantage evaporating in the storm. Abrams tanks, whose thermal sights could spot enemy vehicles for miles in clear conditions, struggled to identify targets at point-blank range. GPS systems, revolutionary for their time, sometimes lost signal in the thickest storms. The Iraqi forces, familiar with these conditions, used the weather as cover to shift positions and launch counterattacks. The US military had created a new category of weapon, smart bombs that could hit a target with unprecedented precision. But precision meant nothing when you couldn't see the target. During one fierce Shamal, an entire squadron of Apache helicopters became disoriented in the swirling sand. Their pilots, despite having night vision and advanced navigation systems, were forced to land and wait out the storm, just as Alexander the Great's armies had done 2,300 years earlier. This meteorological challenge sparked a revolution in military technology. The Pentagon began developing new sensors that could penetrate sandstorms, weather-hardened components that could survive desert conditions, and targeting systems that didn't rely solely on visual or infrared guidance. They even created specialized meteorological units that could forecast Shamal conditions with unprecedented accuracy. The Gulf War proved that the eternal struggle between military power and weather had entered a new phase. It wasn't enough to have superior weapons, they had to be designed to function in nature's worst conditions. As one general noted, we didn't just need to defeat the enemy's army. We had to defeat their weather. the lessons of Desert Storm rippled through the defense industry. New materials were developed to resist sand erosion. Aircraft engines were redesigned to filter out dust more effectively. Even humble windshield wipers were re-engineered to handle sandstorm conditions. Modern military equipment is now tested in specialized facilities that can replicate the worst sandstorms on Earth, a direct legacy of those blind missions over Iraq. Yet for all our technological advancement, we haven't conquered weather. We've simply learned to respect it. Each new weapon system, no matter how sophisticated, must still prove itself against humanity's oldest adversary, the raw power of nature itself. The battlefield of weather, military strategies, and climate challenges. In a classified facility deep beneath Cheyenne Mountain, Colorado, military meteorologists monitor global weather patterns with technology that would seem like sorcery to the commanders of the past. Satellites track storm systems with millimeter precision. Supercomputers model atmospheric conditions months in advance. Real-time data flows in from sensors scattered across every ocean and continent. Yet despite this quantum leap in capability, modern military planners lose sleep over the same fundamental question that haunted Kublai Khan, Napoleon, Hitler, and countless others. What will the weather do tomorrow? The future of warfare and weather presents paradoxes that would baffle the great commanders of history. Climate change has opened Arctic shipping lanes, creating new tactical challenges in regions that were once frozen wastelands. Rising sea levels threaten coastal military installations worldwide. Extreme weather events disrupt operations with increasing frequency. The Pentagon now ranks climate change as a major security threat, not just for its direct impact on military operations, but for its potential to spark new conflicts over water resources, arable land, and habitable territory. The supreme irony remains. As our ability to predict weather has reached unprecedented heights, the weather itself has become more unpredictable. Yet the fundamental lesson from 5 centuries of military history rings clear. No army is mightier than nature, no strategy more decisive than the sky above. The greatest military minds of each era learned this truth the hard way, writing it in frozen blood on Russian snow, in splintered ships on Japanese shores, in mud-drowned tanks on eastern roads. The only difference is that now, finally, we're learning to listen to the weather before it teaches us another costly lesson. The next generation of military leaders faces challenges their predecessors never imagined. Hypersonic weapons that must navigate increasingly unstable atmospheric conditions, autonomous systems that must function in weather extremes, and armies that must operate in environments transformed by climate change. But they have one advantage over every commander in this book. They know with certainty that weather isn't just part of the battlefield. It is the battlefield